My name is Amelia. I'm 28 years old right now. And I know that doesn't sound old. I know that. But let me tell you, there are days it feels like I've lived about 3 lifetimes in those 28 years. 'Cause 5 years ago my sister told a lie. A single, deliberate, calculated lie. And my entire family? They believed her. Over me. Without even blinking. And this is the story of how I lost everything, and then somehow became the only person my family had left. I want you to think back to the last time your family felt like a safe place. Not perfect, no family is, but safe. Like no matter what happened out there in the world, you could come home and the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally actually did. I had that. Or at least I thought I did. For 23 years, I genuinely believed that my family was one of the good ones. Messy, yeah. Loud at holidays, sure. But solid. I thought we were solid. We grew up in a mid-sized town in Ohio, the kind of place where everybody knows your last name, where your parents' reputation follows you into job interviews, and where the local diner still has your dad's favorite booth reserved on Sunday mornings. My dad, Robert Morrison, was a mechanical engineer who worked the same company for over 2 decades. Quiet man. Methodical. Kind of guy who believed that if you kept your head down and worked hard, life would reward you fairly. My mom, Diane, was a part-time bookkeeper and full-time everything else. She ran the house, managed the finances, organized every birthday party, every school event, every Christmas morning down to the last ribbon on the last present. She was warm, capable, and she loved her kids, or at least that's what I always believed. And then there was my sister, Amber. Amber was 2 years younger than me, 21 when this whole thing went down. She was the kind of person who lit up a room the second she walked in. Charming, funny, quick with a joke. People loved her effortlessly. Teachers loved her. Neighbors loved her. My parents, well, they adored her. And I don't say that out of jealousy, I say it because it was just the plain truth. Amber had always been the favorite, and I had made my peace with that a long time ago. It wasn't something that kept me up at night. I had my own thing going. I was doing fine. I had just finished my associate degree in IT networking and landed a junior technician position at a mid-sized tech support firm called ClearPath Solutions. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. I was good at it. I showed up on time, I solved problems fast, and my supervisor, a no-nonsense woman named Patricia, had already mentioned my name in 2 internal performance reviews. I was saving money. I was building something. Life wasn't flashy, but it had a direction, and that direction felt good. I was still living at home at the time, paying a small amount in rent to my parents, eating dinner with them a few nights a week, helping my dad with yard work on weekends. It wasn't a dependent situation. It was a choice to stay close while I built up enough savings to eventually get my own place. I had a timeline. I had a plan. I remember sitting on the back porch with my dad one evening in late September, both of us watching the sun drop behind the neighbor's oak tree, and him saying, "You're doing all right, Case." That's high praise from Robert Morrison. That's basically a standing ovation. Amber had been living at home too, but her situation was different. She had started and stopped community college twice, changed her major 3 times, and was currently doing part-time work at a boutique downtown while figuring out her next move. My parents never pressured her about it. They were patient with her in a way they'd never quite been with me, but again, I had accepted that. I wasn't bitter. I was busy moving forward. Problems started, and I hate that I can pinpoint this so clearly, on a Tuesday in early October. Amber had borrowed my laptop a few days before because hers was acting up. I let her use it without a second thought. We were family. That's what you do. I didn't hover over her, didn't ask what she was using it for, didn't put a timer on it. I just said, "Yeah, go ahead," and went back to whatever I was doing. When she returned it, everything seemed normal. She handed it back, said thanks, went to her room. That was it. No weird vibe. No hesitation. Nothing that made me think anything was off. I plugged it in, set it on my desk, and didn't think about it again for several days. The following Sunday, my parents asked me to sit down with them in the living room. Not at the dinner table, the living room. That was unusual. The living room was where serious things happened. The living room was where my dad had told us his own father passed away. It was where my mom had told us they were refinancing the house. It wasn't a casual space. My stomach dropped the second my dad patted the couch cushion and said, "Casey, sit down, sweetheart." My mom had her arms crossed. My dad had his hands on his knees, leaning forward. Neither of them looked at me with warmth. They looked at me with something I had never seen directed at me before, disappointment mixed with something harder than that, something colder. My dad spoke first. He said they had found something on my laptop. He said that Amber had accidentally opened a folder when she was using it and had come to them because she didn't know what to do and she was upset. He said the folder contained messages, explicit, inappropriate messages, exchanged with someone he recognized as a married man from our neighborhood. A man named Greg who had a wife and 2 young kids 2 streets over. I felt the room tilt. I told them I didn't know what they were talking about. I told them that was impossible. I told them I had never, not once, been involved with anyone like that, let alone a married man in our own neighborhood. I could hear my own voice going up, getting louder, not out of guilt but out of sheer disbelief, because the accusation was so far outside of anything I had ever done or would ever do that my brain couldn't process it fast enough to stay calm. My mom started crying. Not the kind of crying that looks like she was relieved to hear my denial, the kind of crying that had already made up its mind. My dad held up a hand and said they had already seen what they saw, and that Amber had shown them on the laptop right there in this very room the night before. He said they had deleted everything because they didn't want it in the house, but that they knew what they saw. I asked to see the laptop. I asked them to show me. My dad said there was nothing left to show because they had deleted the folder and cleared everything as well. I asked them to let me check anyway, let me look through the whole machine, let me show them that nothing was there, that there was no trace of what they were describing because it never existed. My mom shook her head and said it didn't matter, that the damage was done, that Amber was devastated and that she couldn't even look at me right now. I sat there in complete silence for a moment. And then I said the only thing that made any logical sense to me. I said, "Amber is lying." My dad stood up. And I want to be very clear, my father never raised his hand to me, not once in my entire life. But in that moment, the way he stood up, the look on his face, it was like I had said the most vile thing a person could say. He told me that Amber had nothing to gain from making something like this up. He told me that she came to them in tears, that she had been shaking, that she was genuinely disturbed by what she found. He told me that Amber loved me and would never do something like this without reason. And I looked at my mother, hoping she would be the voice of reason, hoping she would say, "Robert, wait, let's think about this." But she just sat there with her hands in her lap, eyes wet, and she nodded along with everything my dad said. She had already chosen. They had both already chosen. Before I even sat down on that couch, the verdict was in. By the end of that conversation, my dad told me he needed me out of the house within 2 weeks. He said he would not say anything to anyone in the neighborhood, and I should note that he said this like he was doing me a favor, but that he could not have me living under the same roof as the family anymore. My mom didn't contradict him. She just kept wiping her eyes. I asked if I could talk to Amber. My dad said Amber didn't want to speak to me. I asked if I could at least ask her to look me in the eye and say what she was claiming was true. My dad walked to the front door and held it open and said I should go clear my head and come back later to figure out the moving timeline. I walked out of that house and sat in my car for 45 minutes. I didn't cry. I was too shocked to cry. I just sat there with both hands on the steering wheel, the engine off, staring at the garage door. Kept running through every possibility, every logical explanation. Had someone planted something on my laptop? Had Amber staged something, created fake screenshots somehow, shown my parents a fabricated conversation that she had manufactured herself? Had some kind of malware put files on my machine without my knowledge? None of it made clean sense. But the most logical answer, the one that kept rising back to the top no matter how many times I pushed it down, was the one I had already said out loud. Amber had lied. For reasons I didn't fully understand yet, my sister had constructed a story and walked it straight into my parents' living room and burned my entire life to the ground with it. In the days that followed, I tried everything I could think of within reason. I texted Amber, calm, measured texts, not accusatory, just asking her to talk to me, asking her what she thought she saw, asking her to please think about what she was doing to me. She read every single one. She responded to none. I emailed my parents a detailed explanation of why the accusation made no sense, of what I actually had on my laptop, of the fact that the IT professional in me could walk them through every single file if they would just give me access. My dad replied with 3 sentences saying that he hoped I would use this time for reflection and that the conversation was closed. I went to my laptop and combed through everything myself. There was nothing. Obviously, there was nothing. Whatever Amber had shown them, if she had actually shown them anything at all and hadn't just described something fabricated, it had come from somewhere else. But without my parents giving me the chance to prove anything, without any actual investigation, I was just a woman defending herself in an empty room. I told 2 people what happened, my college friend Maya, who had known me for years and whose immediate response was, "That's insane, Casey, you would never," and a coworker named Derek who I was friendly with. Both believed me. But belief from 2 people doesn't rebuild a life. Belief from 2 people doesn't undo the look on your mother's face when she realizes she's chosen your sister over you without blinking. I moved out exactly 11 days after that conversation. I found a room in a shared apartment about 20 minutes away, 2 other women, a cramped kitchen, a shared bathroom with a shower that took 4 minutes to get warm. Cost me $450 a month, which was manageable on my salary if I cut everything else down to the bone. I bought a used mattress, a second-hand dresser, and a folding table that I used as a desk. I set up my laptop on that folding table and I looked at my life and I thought, okay, this is where we are now. The grief hit me in waves over those first few weeks, and I want to be honest about that because I think sometimes in stories like this people skip over the grief and jump straight to the montage of getting back on your feet. But there was real grief. There were nights when I'd be eating cereal at my folding table at 10 o'clock at night and the weight of it would just descend, not just the injustice of it, but the specific pain of knowing that my mother had looked at me like a stranger. That my father, a man I genuinely admired, had chosen to believe the worst about me without a moment's investigation. That my sister, my little sister, the girl I had driven to the emergency room when she sprained her ankle in 8th grade, the girl I had helped move into her first dorm before she dropped out, the girl I had lent my laptop to without a second thought, had done this to me. Had looked at the trust one placed in her and decided to use it as a weapon. I didn't understand why. That was the part that kept eating at me in those early months. The why. What had I done? What had I said? What was going on in Amber's life that made destroying mine a solution to anything? I turned it over endlessly, the way you turn a stone looking for something living underneath it, and I just kept coming up empty. I couldn't identify a specific argument we'd had, a specific moment of conflict. We weren't close in the deep confiding your secrets way, but we had always been decent to each other. Civil, even warm sometimes. There was one thing I would later come to understand, though not until much later. Around the time she borrowed my laptop, Amber had been dealing with something she hadn't told anyone in the family about directly. A guy she had been seeing, someone named Brandon, had apparently been pressuring her to move in with him. She wanted the money from my parents to make that happen, money my parents had been reluctant to give because they hadn't approved of the relationship. I only found this out secondhand much later from an aunt who had pieced together the timeline. Whether eliminating me from the picture somehow made it easier for Amber to extract that financial support, whether she thought that with me gone, my parents' resources and attention would consolidate entirely around her, I genuinely can't say for certain. I can only tell you what eventually came to light. But I'm getting ahead of myself. What I can tell you is that in those first 6 months after leaving home, I made a decision that I think saved me. I decided I was going to stop trying to get my family to believe me and start building a life that didn't require their belief to survive. Sounds clean when I say it that way, but it wasn't a clean decision. It was messy and painful, and I made it in stages, not all at once. There were still moments, late nights, holidays spent alone, passing a family-style restaurant on a Sunday morning, where I would feel the pull to call my mom, to try again, to send one more email, to make one more attempt at being heard. But every time I reached for my phone, I stopped myself. 'Cause every attempt I had made so far had been met with silence or dismissal, and at some point you have to accept that banging your head against a wall is a choice. You can stop. You're allowed to stop. So I stopped. And I turned all of that energy inward. Toward myself. Toward my work. Toward my future. Trisha at ClearPath noticed. She noticed because I was already good before the fallout, and I became exceptional after it. When you strip away everything else, the safety net, the comfort, the Sunday dinners, the casual assumption that someone has your back, what you're left with is the sharpest version of your focus. I threw myself into networking certifications. I stayed late. I volunteered for the complicated tickets nobody else wanted. I started learning cloud infrastructure on my own time, watching tutorials on that folding table until midnight, then getting up at 6 and doing it again. Within 8 months of leaving home, I had earned 2 industry certifications. Trisha moved me from junior technician to systems analyst. The raise wasn't enormous, but it was meaningful. I moved out of the shared apartment and into a 1-bedroom of my own. It was small. Carpet was older than me. Kitchen window faced a brick wall. But it was mine. Entirely, completely mine. I stood in the middle of that empty apartment on the first day with a duffel bag over my shoulder, and I felt something I didn't expect to feel. I felt proud. Not happy exactly. Not healed. But proud in a way that had nothing to do with anyone else's approval for the first time in my life. I kept my social circle tight. Maya stayed a constant, the kind of friend who doesn't require explanation, who just shows up with food when things are hard and acts like it's normal. I started going to the gym, not for any dramatic transformation reason, but because I needed somewhere to put the anger that still lived in my chest. An hour on the weights or a long run on the treadmill, and the anger had somewhere to go. It helped. It helped more than I expected. ClearPath, there was a man named Jake who worked in project coordination. We started talking in the break room, first about work, then about everything else. He had a dry sense of humor and a way of listening that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. We weren't in any rush. Neither of us came to it needing to be rescued or needing the other person to fill some missing piece. We just became important to each other, gradually and honestly. By the end of my 2nd year at the company, we were together. Not in a dramatic, this changes everything way. In a quiet, steady, this is good way. And after everything I had been through, quiet and steady felt like luxury. I heard things about my family from time to time through extended relatives. My Aunt Carol, my mom's sister, who had always liked me and who remained carefully neutral during all of it. She'd check in occasionally, not to relitigate anything, just to make sure I was still standing. Through her, I learned that Amber had indeed moved in with Brandon, that my parents had helped her financially, and that the relationship had lasted about 14 months before collapsing. I also learned through Carol that my mother had started asking about me, asking Carol if she'd heard from me, whether I was okay, whether I seemed all right. I didn't respond to those indirect inquiries. Not out of cruelty, but out of self-preservation. I had worked too hard to rebuild my peace to risk it on conversations that might go nowhere. By year 3, I had moved from systems analyst to IT infrastructure lead. ClearPath had grown substantially, and Patricia had recommended me for a team management role that I initially wasn't sure I wanted. Managing people was different from solving technical problems. It required a different kind of patience, a different kind of attention. But I tried it. And I found, maybe surprisingly, that I was decent at it. Probably because I had spent so much time understanding what it felt like to not be believed, to not be given a fair hearing, I made it a point to actually listen to the people on my team. To give them the benefit of the doubt. To not make decisions about people without facts in front of me. funny how your deepest wounds can become the foundation of your greatest strengths if you let them. I didn't let myself get comfortable with the idea of justice. I want to be honest about that. There were periods, months at a time, when I genuinely stopped thinking about Amber and my parents with any kind of heat. When the story of what happened to me became just that, a story, a chapter, something from before. I was living my life. I had Jake. I had work I was proud of. I had an apartment that had slowly become a home. I had Maya and a handful of good people around me. The wound had scarred over. It wasn't gone, but it wasn't bleeding either. But then year 4 brought something I hadn't anticipated. Patricia announced she was retiring. And before she left, she sat me down privately and told me she had put my name forward for a director-level position that was being created as the company restructured its IT division. Director of Infrastructure. The salary jump was significant. The responsibility was enormous. And I was, according to Patricia, who did not give out compliments lightly, the most qualified person for it inside the company. I remember sitting with that conversation on the drive home, thinking about the version of me that had sat in that cramped room 4 years earlier, eating cereal at a folding table, feeling like everything had been taken from me. I thought about my dad saying, "You're doing all right," case on that back porch before it all fell apart, and I thought about how different it felt to have someone who had watched me work for years say something similar, but earned this time. Earned in full view, without family obligation, without blood loyalty. Just earned. I got the position. And the day I got it, I sat in my car in the parking garage and I let myself feel all of it, the pride, the grief, the anger that had never fully dissolved, and something underneath all of it that I can only describe as relief. Relief that I had not let what they did to me become the ending of my story. I was 28 years old. 5 years had passed since that Sunday in the living room. 5 years since my dad held the front door open and looked at me like I was someone he didn't recognize. 5 years of silence. 5 years of building. 5 years of becoming someone who didn't need their version of me to be the true one. The call came on a Wednesday evening in early March. I was at my desk finishing up a quarterly infrastructure report when my phone lit up with a number I didn't immediately recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail. Something made me pick up instead. It was my mother. Her voice was different than I remembered, older, more fragile at the edges, the kind of voice that tells you immediately that something is wrong before the words even come. She said my name twice. Casey. Casey, it's Mom. Like she wasn't sure I would know who she was. Like she wasn't sure I would stay on the line. I said hello. Kept my voice level. I didn't give her anything beyond that. She told me that Amber was in the hospital. She said it had started 2 days ago. Amber had been having severe abdominal pain that she had dismissed for almost a week before it got to the point where she couldn't stand up straight. They had taken her to the ER at St. Joseph's Medical Center. The diagnosis was a ruptured ovarian cyst complicated by a secondary infection that had progressed more than the doctors initially realized. She was stable, my mother said, but she needed a surgical procedure and there were complications with her insurance, coverage gaps, out-of-network providers, a situation that had ballooned into something neither of my parents fully understood how to navigate. She said my dad was dealing with some health issues of his own. His back had deteriorated badly over the past year and he wasn't in a position to drive reliably, and that she didn't know who else to call. She paused for a long time after saying that. And then she said very quietly, "You work in technology and you've always been the one who could figure things out." I didn't know who else to call. I let the silence sit for a moment. Not cruelly, I want to be clear about that. I wasn't savoring her discomfort. But I needed a second. Because the irony of what I was hearing, my mother calling me, the daughter she had thrown out of her house based on a lie told by the daughter who was now lying in a hospital bed, was not lost on me. Not even slightly. I told her I would come to the hospital. I told her I needed a couple of hours to wrap up what I was doing and then I would drive over. She exhaled, one of those long, shaky exhales that carries a month's worth of held tension in it. She said, "Thank you, Casey." And the way she said it, the weight in those 3 words told me she understood at least partially what it meant that I was saying yes. Called Jake. He listened to the whole thing and then he said, "How are you feeling about it?" Not "you should go" or "you don't have to go," just "how are you feeling?" That's the kind of person he was. He let me land on my own answer. I told him I was feeling a lot of things and that going was still the right thing to do. He said he agreed and that he'd leave the light on. I drove to St. Joseph's Medical Center at about 7:30 in the evening. The hospital was 20 minutes from my apartment. I had driven past it hundreds of times without ever thinking about it as a place that would carry weight for me. I parked in the visitor structure, sat in the car for about 3 minutes, and reminded myself of who I was now. Not the 23-year-old who had walked out of her parents' house in shock. Not the girl in the cramped room with the cold shower. I was 28 years old. And I had built something real. Nobody could take that from me, not even this moment. I walked through the sliding glass doors of the ER and found my mother sitting in the waiting area near the second set of elevators. She looked smaller than I remembered. Her hair had more gray in it. She was wearing a fleece jacket I recognized from years ago, and she had her purse in her lap with both hands wrapped around the strap like she needed something to hold on to. When she saw me, she stood up immediately, and I could see her eyes fill up before she even took a step toward me. She reached for a hug and I allowed it, briefly, sincerely, but without dissolving into it. I wasn't cold. I wasn't there to make her feel worse. But I also wasn't going to pretend that 5 years of silence and pain had evaporated in a hospital parking lot. I patted her back and stepped back and said, "Tell me what's going on." She walked me through everything: the insurance issue, the bills already accumulating, the surgical team's recommendation, the out-of-network anesthesiologist that the hospital had apparently assigned without anyone catching it in time. It was genuinely messy, and it was genuinely overwhelming for someone who didn't deal with systems like this regularly. But it wasn't beyond solving. I pulled out my phone and started making calls. First to the hospital's patient advocacy office, which was closed but had an after-hours line for exactly these kinds of billing disputes. I got a caseworker on the line, explained the situation clearly, documented everything they told me, and got a reference number for a formal coverage review that could begin the next morning. I spoke with the charge nurse on Amber's floor and got a clear picture of the medical timeline. I called the insurance company's emergency line and escalated the out-of-network claim to their appeals department, which bought a 72-hour hold on the billing dispute while the case was reviewed. In 2 hours, I had done more than my parents had managed in 2 days, not because I was smarter than them, but because I knew how to navigate institutions and they didn't, and because I could operate calmly under pressure in a way that's hard to do when it's your child lying in a hospital bed. My mother sat beside me through all of it, watching me work. At one point, I caught her looking at me with an expression I didn't quite have words for. Not quite guilt, not quite wonder, something in between. I didn't acknowledge it. I just kept working. At around 9:30, the nurse told us Amber was awake and that she could have a visitor. My mother looked at me and said, "Would you like to come up?" I said yes. We took the elevator to the 3rd floor. Room 314. The door was partially open, and the room was the way hospital rooms always are. That specific kind of fluorescent quiet, the steady beep of a monitor, the antiseptic smell underneath everything else. Amber was in the bed, propped up slightly against the pillows, a saline drip running into her left arm. She looked pale. Not dramatically so, but the color wasn't there. Her hair was pulled back and there were shadows under her eyes from what I guessed was very little sleep and a significant amount of pain. She looked at me when I walked in and something moved across her face that I had never seen on Amber before. Not in 21 years of knowing her. She looked small. Genuinely small. Not performing smallness, not putting on an act for the audience. Actually small. Like someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and was very, very tired. I pulled a chair to the side of the bed. My mother stayed near the door, giving us space, whether intentionally or not. Amber looked at me for a long moment and then she said, "You came." I said, "Yeah, I came." She looked at the 4 in her arm. She said, "You didn't have to." I said, "No, I didn't." Another silence. Long enough that the monitor beeped several times into it. And then Amber looked up at me again and her eyes were wet and she said, "I'm sorry, Casey." She said it without preamble, without setup, without a big dramatic build-up. She just said it like it had been sitting in her chest for years and needed somewhere to land. "I'm so sorry for what I did to you. It was wrong. It was a terrible, awful, wrong thing to do, and I have thought about it almost every day since." I didn't say anything. Not because I was withholding, but because I needed to hear it all. I needed to let her finish. She told me what I had suspected for years. She told me she had fabricated the whole thing. There were no messages. There was no folder. She had gone to my parents with a story she had constructed entirely, and the reason she had barely been able to look at herself in the mirror for 5 years over, was money. She had needed a chunk of money to move in with Brandon, and she had known my parents were reluctant to give it directly. She had thought that if there was a crisis, if there was a reason for everyone's attention to shift, she could get what she needed in the chaos. She hadn't fully thought through what it would cost me. Or she had thought about it and told herself it would blow over. She said the words she was ashamed of. "I told myself you'd be fine. I told myself you were strong and you'd figure it out." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. That was such a coward's reasoning. I know that now. I knew it then and I did it anyway. I sat with that for a long moment. And then I said very calmly, very evenly, not loudly, not with heat, I said, "Amber, I want you to understand what that cost me. Not so you can feel worse than you already do. But because you asked for my help tonight and I came, and I think that deserves honesty between us." She nodded. She was crying openly now, quiet tears, not performing grief but genuinely sitting in it. I told her about the room with the cold shower. I told her about the cereal at the folding table. I told her about eating alone on Thanksgiving for 2 years because I didn't want to impose on anyone else's family and I sure wasn't welcome at mine. I told her about the nights when I had reached for my phone to call my mom and put it back down because I was trying to protect myself from another rejection. I told her about the promotion she hadn't seen, the apartment I had built into a real home, the person I had become in the years she wasn't watching. Not to brag, but to show her that the rubble she left behind me had become a foundation. And that I had done that. Not despite what she did, but partly through it. 'Cause when everything is stripped away, you find out what you're actually made of. She was quiet through all of it. She didn't try to interrupt or explain herself further. She just listened. And when I was done, she said, "I don't deserve your forgiveness. I just want you to know I'm sorry. Truly." I said, "I believe you." And then I said, "Forgiveness isn't something I'm handing out tonight. That's something I'll work through on my own time. But you are my sister, and you are in a hospital bed, and I am going to make sure your insurance situation gets sorted out because that's the right thing to do. Not because everything is okay between us. Just because it's the right thing to do." She nodded again. She looked exhausted and relieved and wrecked all at once. I stood up, straightened the chair, and headed toward the door. My mother was still standing in the doorway. She had heard all of it. Her face was doing something I had never seen my mother's face do. She was holding herself absolutely still, the way people do when they're trying not to fall apart completely. Her eyes were red. Her hands were clasped in front of her. And she looked at me and said, "Casey, I owe you an apology too. A real one. Not tonight, I know tonight isn't the time, but I owe you one. And your father does too." I looked at her for a moment. This woman who had been in my life for 28 years. Who had made my lunches and braided my sister's hair and kept every birthday card we ever gave her in a shoebox in the closet. Who had sat on that couch and chosen her daughter's lie over her other daughter's truth without a second look. She was a woman who had made a terrible decision out of love for the wrong child in the wrong moment, and she was going to have to live with that. She already was living with it. I could see that clearly. I said, "I know, Mom." And then I said, "Take care of her tonight. I'll follow up with the insurance caseworker in the morning." I walked to the elevator alone. I pressed the button for the lobby. The doors closed and I stood in that small, quiet box of space and I let myself breathe, a full, deep, genuine breath. Not triumph. Not pure happiness. Something more complicated and more real than either of those things. Something that felt like the closing of a chapter that I had been holding open for 5 years, waiting for the ending to arrive. The next morning, I made the calls I said I would make. The insurance caseworker assigned overnight had made progress on the out-of-network appeal. It was looking like the bulk of the anesthesiologist's fee would be covered under an exception clause that applied specifically to emergencies. I forwarded the documentation to my mother's email address, an email address I still had from before everything fell apart, and I wrote a brief note explaining the next steps and who to follow up with if anything stalled. Professional. Clear. Complete. My dad called me that afternoon. His voice was exactly as I remembered it, measured, low, deliberate. But there was something in it I had never heard from Robert Morrison in my entire life. Uncertainty. He said, "Casey." He paused. He said, "I owe you more than a phone call." But I needed to start somewhere. He said he had not known what to believe when Amber came to them that night, and that he had made the choice to trust his daughter over his other daughter and that he had been wrong to do it the way he did it. He said he had been wrong to not investigate. He said he had been wrong to not give me a fair hearing. He said, "I'm sorry, Casey. For all of it." My dad was not a man who apologized easily. This was not a small thing from Robert Morrison. This was enormous. And I told him I heard him. I told him I was glad he called. I told him we had time, that rebuilding trust didn't happen in a single conversation and I wasn't expecting it to, but that I was open to the conversation eventually. Not right now. But eventually. He said he understood. He said he was proud of me, not in the casual way he'd said it on the back porch all those years ago, but in a way that carried the weight of everything that had happened since. "I am proud of you, Casey. You have every right to tell me that doesn't mean anything to you anymore. But I want you to know it anyway." I told him it still meant something. I told him that honestly. The weeks that followed were not a fairy tale. I want to be clear about that. My family did not reunite overnight. There was no big dinner where everyone hugged and the music swelled and everything was fine. That's not how real life works. Real life is slower and messier and more honest than that. What happened was incremental. A phone call here. An email there. My mother asking if I wanted to come by for dinner sometime. Not demanding it, not assuming it, just offering it gently like you'd offer something to someone who has the full right to say no. I said not yet. And then a few weeks later I said maybe. And then I went. And we sat around the table with the weight of everything between us, not pretending it wasn't there, not forcing warmth that hadn't been re-earned yet, just eating together and talking carefully and beginning, very slowly, very cautiously, to figure out what we were to each other now. Amber and I, that took longer. It needed to. She had done a specific thing to me, a deliberate thing, and the apology in that hospital room was a starting point, not an ending point. We texted a little. We had one coffee about 2 months after the hospital. It was awkward and honest and uncomfortable and necessary. She was in therapy, she told me. She had been for about a year, and part of what she was working through was what she had done to me and why, and what it said about the person she had been and who she was trying to become. I respected that. I didn't trust her the way I had before, maybe I never fully would, but I respected the attempt at accountability. And I told her so. What changed most, though, was something internal. Something that had nothing to do with my family's apologies or Amber's growth or my parents' attempts at repair. It was something I felt in myself in the months that followed, a quieting. The long, low hum of injustice that had been underneath everything for 5 years, that I had carried in my body like a frequency I couldn't turn off, it became quieter. Not because the wrong had been fully righted. Not because everyone had been perfectly punished or perfectly redeemed. But because I had lived the answer to the question that had haunted me most. Could I build something real and worthy on the other side of being torn down? The answer, it turned out, was yes. The answer was a director title and a real apartment and a good relationship with a man who actually knew me. The answer was 2 industry certifications earned on a folding table in a room with a cold shower. The answer was the fact that when my family needed someone to walk through a hospital and make calm phone calls and solve difficult problems, they called me. Not because I was perfect or because I had been waiting for my moment, but because the woman I had become in those 5 years was the person they needed. And I was okay, I was genuinely okay with being that woman. I'm not going to sit here and tell you I have no scars from all of it. I do. I think about trust differently than I used to. I extend it more carefully, more intentionally. I'm probably more self-reliant than is always healthy. There are still moments where the memory surfaces, the living room, my mother's face, my dad at the door, and it still carries a sting. Not a devastation. A sting. The difference between those two things is the entire distance I traveled in 5 years. But here's what I want to leave you with, because I think this is the part that actually matters. The thing about betrayal, real betrayal, the kind that comes from the people closest to you, is that it forces you into a reckoning with yourself. Strips away the comfortable assumption that you are okay because the people around you say you are. And when that assumption is gone, when you are standing in an empty apartment with a duffel bag over your shoulder and a folding table in the corner, you find out what's actually true. Not what your family says about you. Not what the accusation says about you. What is actually fundamentally true about who you are and what you are capable of. What I found when all the noise was stripped away was someone I hadn't fully met before. Someone who was more capable than I knew, more resilient than I had been tested on, more whole than I had needed to be when comfort was available. The version of Amelia that walked out of St. Joseph's Medical Center that night, the one who had made the calls, had the conversation, said the hard true things calmly, and then driven home with her dignity intact. That woman had been built in 5 years of silence and struggle. My parents didn't build her. My sister's lie didn't build her. I built her. 1 cold shower, 1 certification exam, 1 late night at a folding table at a time. And that's the thing no one can take from you. Not a lie. Not a family's betrayal. Not years of silence. Not the sting of being unchosen by the people who were supposed to choose you first. Nobody can take away what you build in the quiet. What you build when nobody's watching, when there's no applause, when the only reason you're doing it is because you refused, absolutely refused, to let someone else's worst moment become your permanent address. My name is Amelia. I was 23 years old when my sister lied and my parents believed her and my life fell apart. I was 28 when I walked into a hospital room and became the person my family needed most. And somewhere in between those 2 moments, in the years they didn't see and the work they didn't witness, I became someone I am genuinely proud to be. Not because of what was done to me. In spite of it. And that right there is the only revenge that ever actually mattered. You've been through something like this, not necessarily this exact story, but the particular pain of being falsely accused by the people who should know you best, of being cast out by family, of having to rebuild your entire sense of self from scratch. I want you to hear this clearly. The silence is survivable. The struggle is survivable. The reinvention is not only survivable, it is possible in a way you cannot fully see from where you're standing right now. The version of you that exists on the other side of it is someone you haven't met yet. And I promise you, from someone who has stood in that empty apartment on that side of it, it is worth the walk. That's my story. Thanks for listening.